Hello and welcome back yet again to another evening of me reading from this very old book that I found. And it contained Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it also contained three other short stories, one of which we have read already, and that was Fortune Wildred. And now we're going to read the tale Lizzie Leigh, or Lizzie Leigh, by Elizabeth Gaskell. I spent a little bit of time on Wikipedia, and yes, indeed, this story is by Elizabeth Gaskell, who had quite the biography. Like on Wikipedia, I learned a lot about her, and now I kind of would like to find some more of her other books, especially evidently she wrote a lot for Charles Dickens, having her works published in his periodical that he made, of various short stories. And she wrote a lot about Victorian life. She wrote a lot about industrial things, and she wrote a lot of ghost stories, which is kind of what I'm like, I would like some gothic ghost stories. If I find any more of her works, I will probably read them. She wrote a bunch of different novels. She actually was the first person to write a biography for Elizabeth Bronte, and she seems to have had quite the prolific life and career. The only thing I'm a little bit worried about is, according to Wikipedia, she wrote with a lot of the local dialects. So there could be some interesting words that I have no idea what they mean. Um, Evidently, there's a dialect word in one of her other novels, Mary Barton Nesh, which is a person who feels the cold easily or often feels cold. So I'm Nesh. But it does seem really interesting. Elizabeth Gaskell was born in September of 1810, and she died in November of 1865. I have a couple of interesting pictures of her from Wikipedia. You can see, let's see if I can get that right there. A portrait was made of her when she was young. Quite the fetching portrait. And then there's also a very early photograph of her when she's a little bit older and a little bit more matronly. But yeah, I thought that it seemed really interesting. And I know that at least Hazel said she has heard or read some of Elizabeth Gaskell's other stories. So today we are going to read, and this one won't be a one shot. It's a little bit longer than Fortune Wildred. I think it has 3 chapters, so we'll just do a chapter a night. So we are going to begin Lizzie Leigh by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 1. When death is present in a household on a Christmas day, the very contrast between the time as it now is and the day as it has often been gives a poignancy to sorrow, a more utter blackness to the desolation. James Leigh died just as the faraway bells of Rochdale Church were ringing for the morning service on Christmas Day, 1836. A few minutes before his death, he opened his already glazing eyes and made a sign to his wife by the faint motion of his lips that he had yet something to say. She stooped close down and caught the broken whisper, "I forgive her, Anne. May God forgive me." "Oh, my love, my dear, only get well, and I shall never cease showing my thanks for those words. May God in heaven bless thee for saying them. Thou art not so restless, my lad. Maybe, oh God." For even while she spoke, he died. They had been 22 years man and wife. For 19 of those years, their lives had been calm and happy, as the most perfect uprightness on one side and the most complete confidence and loving submission on the other could make it. Milton's famous line might have been framed and hung up as the rule of their married life, for he was truly the interpreter who stood between God and her. She would have considered herself wicked if she had ever dared even think him austere, though, as certainly as he was an upright man, assuredly he was hard, stern, and inflexible. But for 3 years, the moan and murmur had never been out of her heart, and she had rebelled against her husband as a tyrant with a hidden sullen rebellion, which tore up the old landmarks of wifely duty and affection, and poisoned the fountains whence greatest love and reverence had once been ever springing. But those last blessed words replaced him on his throne in her heart and called out penitent anguish for all the bitter estrangement of later years. It was this which made her refuse all the entreaties of her son so that she would see the kind-hearted neighbors who called on their way from church to sympathize and condone. No, she would stay with the dead husband that had spoken tenderly at last, if for 3 years he had kept silent. Who knew but what, if she had only been more gentle and less angrily reserved, he might have relented earlier and in time. She sat, rocking herself to and fro by the side of the bed, while the footsteps below went in and out. She had been in sorrow too long to have any violent burst of deep grief now. The furrows were well worn in her cheeks, and the tears flowed quietly, if incessantly, all the day long. But when the winter's night drew on and the neighbors had gone away to their homes, she stole to the window and gazed out long and wistfully over the dark gray moor. She did not hear her son's voice as he spoke to her from the door, nor his footstep as he drew nearer. She startled when he touched her. "Mother, come down to us. There is no one but Will and me. Dearest mother, we do so want you." The poor lad's voice trembled, and he began to cry. It appeared to require an effort on Mrs. Leigh's part to tear herself away from the window, but with a sigh she complied with his request. The two boys, for though Will was nearly 21, she still thought of him as a lad, had done everything in their power to make the house comfortable for her. She herself, in the old days before her sorrow, had never made a brighter fire or a cleaner hearth ready for her husband's return home than now what awaited her. The tea things were all put out, and the kettle was boiling, and the boys had calmed their grief down into a kind of sober cheerfulness. They paid her every attention that they could think of, but received little notice on her part. She did not resist. She rather submitted to all their arrangements, but they did not seem to touch her heart. When tea was ended, it was merely the form of tea that had been gone through. Willie moved the things away to the dresser. His mother leaned back languidly in her chair. "Mother, shall Tom read you a chapter? He's a better scholar than I." "Aye, lad," she said almost eagerly. "That's it. Read me the prodigal son. Aye, aye, lad, thank thee." Tom found the chapter and read it in the high-pitched voice which is customary in village schools. His mother bent forward, her lips parted, her eyes dilated, her whole body instinct with eager attention. Will sat with his head depressed and hung down. He knew why that chapter had been chosen, and to him it recalled the family's disgrace. When the reading had ended, he still hung down his head in gloomy silence, but her face was brighter than it had been before for the day. Her eyes looked dreamy, as if she saw a vision, and by she pulled the Bible towards her, and putting her finger underneath each word, began to read them aloud in a low voice to herself. She read again the words of bitter sorrow and deep humiliation, but most of all she paused and brightened over the Father's tender reception of the repentant prodigal. So went the evening of Christmas on Up Close Farm. The snow had fallen heavily over the dark, waving moorland before the day of the funeral. The black, storm-laden dome of heaven lay very still and close upon the white earth as they carried the body forth out of the house, which had known his presence so long as its ruling power. Two and two the mourners followed, making a black procession in their winding march over the unbeaten snow to the Mill Row Church, now lost in some hollow of the bleak moors, now slowly climbing the heaving ascents. There was no long tarrying after the funeral, for many of the neighbors who accompanied the body to the grave had far to go, and the great white flakes which came slowly down were boding forerunners of a heavy storm. One old friend alone accompanied the widow and her sons to their home. The Up-Close farm had belonged for generations to the Leighs, yet its possession hardly raised them above the rank of laborer. There was a house in the outbuildings, all of an old-fashioned kind, and about 7 acres of barren, unproductive land, which they had never possessed capital enough to improve. Indeed, they could hardly rely upon it for subsistence, and it had been customary to bring up the sons to some trade, such as a wheelwright or a blacksmith. James Leigh had left a will in the possession of the old man who accompanied them home. He read it aloud. James had bequeathed the farm to his faithful wife, Anne, for her lifetime, and after to his son William. The 100 and some odd pounds in the savings bank was to accumulate for Thomas. After the reading was ended, Anne Leigh sat silent for a time, and then she asked to speak to Samuel Orme alone. The sons went into the back kitchen and then strolled out into the fields regardless of the driving snow. The brothers were dearly fond of each other, although they were very different in character. Will, the elder, was like his father, stern, reserved, and scrupulously upright. Tom, who was 10 years younger, was gentle and delicate as a girl, both in appearance and character. He had always clung to his mother and dreaded his father. They did not speak as they walked, for they were only in the habit of talking about facts and hardly knew the more sophisticated language applied to the description of feelings. Meanwhile, their mother had taken a hold of Samuel Orme's arm with a trembling hand. "Samuel, I must let the farm. I must." "Let the farm? What's come over the woman?" "Oh, Samuel," said she, eyes swimming in tears, "I'm just fain to go and live in Manchester. I must let the farm." Samuel looked and pondered, but did not speak for some time, and at last he said, "If thou hast made up thy mind, there's no speaking again it, and thou mustn't go. Thou'll be sadly pottered with the Manchester ways, but that's not my lookout. Why, thou'lt have to buy potatoes, a thing thou hast never done afore in all thy born life. Well, it's not my lookout. It's rather for me than agin me. Our Jenny is going to be married to Tom Higginbottom, and he was speaking of wanting a bit of land to begin upon. His father will be dying sometime, I reckon, and then he'll step into the Croft farm, but meanwhile—" "Then thou'lt let the farm?" said she, still as eager as ever. "Aye, he'll take it fast enough, I've a notion. But I'll not drive a bargain with thee just now. It would not be right. We'll wait a bit." No, I cannot wait. Settle it out at once.
Well, I'll speak to Will about it. I'll see him out yonder. I'll step to him and talk it over. Accordingly, he went and joined the two lads, and without more ado began the subject to them. Will, thy mother is fain to go and live in Manchester, and covets to let the farm. Now, I'm willing to take it for Tom Higginbottom, but I like to drive a keen bargain, and there would be no fun chauffeuring with thy mother just now. Let thee and me buckle to, my lad, and try to cheat each other. It'll warm us this cold day.
Let the farm, said both the boys at once, with infinite surprise. Go live in Manchester.
When Samuel Orme found that the plan had never before been named to either Will or Tom, he would have nothing to do with it, he said, until they had spoken with their mother. Likely she was dazed by her husband's death. He would wait a day or two and not name it to anyone, not to Tom Higginbottom himself, or maybe he would set his heart upon it. The lads had better go in and talk it over with their mother. He told them good day and left them. Will looked very gloomy, but he did not speak until they got near the house, and then he said, Tom, go to the shippen and supper the cows. I want to speak to mother alone. When he entered the house place, she was sitting before the fire looking into its embers. She did not hear him come in. For some time she had lost her quick perception of outward things. Mother, what's this about going to Manchester? He asked.
Oh, lad,
she said, turning around and speaking in a beseeching tone.
I must go and seek out our Lizzie. I cannot rest here for thinking on her. Many's the time I have left thy father sleeping in bed and stole out the window and looked my heart out towards Manchester, till I thought I must just set out and tramp over moor and moss straight away until I got there, and then lift up every downcast face until I came to our Lizzie. And often, when the south wind was blowing soft among the hollows, I've fancied it could be but fancy, thou knowest. I had fancied that I heard her crying upon me, and I've thought the voice came closer and closer till at last she was sobbing out, Mother, close to the door. And I've stolen down and undone the latch before now and looked out into the still black night, thinking to see her, and then turned sick and sorrowful when I heard no living sound but the sound of the wind dying away. Oh, speak not to me of stopping here, when she may be perishing for hunger, like the poor lad in the parable.
And now she lifted up her voice and wept aloud. Will was deeply grieved. He had been old enough to be told the family shame when, more than 2 years before, his father had had his letter to his daughter returned by her mistress in Manchester, telling him that Lizzie had left her service some time, and why. He had sympathized with his father's stern anger, though he had thought him something hard, it's true, when he had forbidden his weeping, heartbroken wife to go and try to find her poor sinful child, and his father had declared that henceforth they would have no daughter, that she should be as one dead, and her name never more be named at market or mealtime in blessing or prayer. He had held his peace, with compressed lips and a contracted brow, when the neighbors had noticed to him how poor Lizzie's death had aged both his father and mother, and how they thought the bereaved couple would never hold their heads up again. He himself had felt as if that one event had made him old before his time, and he envied Tom the tears he had shed over poor, pretty, innocent, dead Lizzie. He thought about her sometimes, till he ground his teeth together and could have struck her down in her shame. His mother had never named her to him till now. Mother, he said at last, She may be dead. Most likely she is."
"No, Will, she is not dead," said Mrs. Leigh. "God will not let her die until I've seen her once again. Thou dost not know how I prayed and prayed just once again to see her sweet face and tell her I've forgiven her, though she's broken my heart, she has, Will."
She could not go on for a minute or two for the sobbing.
"Thou dost not know that, or thou wouldst not say that she could be dead, for God is very merciful, Will, he is. He is much more pitiful than man. I could ne'er have spoken to thy father as I did to him, and yet thy father forgave her at last. The last words that he said was that he forgave her. Thou'lt not be harder than thy father, Will. Do not try to hinder me going to seek her, for it's no use."
Will sat very still for a long time before he spoke. At last he said, "I'll not hinder you. I think she's dead, but that's no matter."
"She is not dead," said her mother,
with low earnestness. Will took no notice. "We will all go to Manchester for a 12-month and let the farm to Tom Higginbottom. I'll get blacksmith's work, and Tom can have good schooling for a while, which he's always got a craving for. At the end of the year, we'll come back, Mother, and give over fretting for Lizzie, and think with me that she is dead, and to my mind that would be more comfort than to think of her as living." He dropped his voice as he said those last words. His mother shook her head but made no answer, and he asked again, "Will you, Mother, agree to this?"
"I agree to it, as it is. If I hear and see naught of her for a 12-month, me being in Manchester looking out, I'll just have a broken heart fairly before the year's ended, and I will know neither love nor sorrow for her any more when I rest in my grave. I'll agree to that, Will."
"Well, I suppose it must be so. I shall not tell Tom, Mother, why we are flitting off to Manchester. Best to spare him."
"As thou wilt," she said sadly, "so that we go, that's all."
And before the wild daffodils were in flower, in the sheltered copses around Upclose Farm, the Leighs were settled in their Manchester home, if they could ever grow to consider that place a home, where there was no garden or outbuilding, no fresh, breezy outlet, no far-stretching view over moor and hollow, no animals to be tended, and what more than they missed, no haunting memories, though. Even those remembrances told of sorrow and the dead and gone. Mrs. Leigh heeded the loss of all these things less than her sons. She had more spirit in her countenance than she had had for months, because now she had hope, of a sad kind, to be sure, but still hope. She performed all of her household duties, strange and complicated as they were, and bewildered as she was with all the town necessities in her new manner of life. But when her house was sided and the boys came home from their work in the evening, she would put on her things and steal out unnoticed, so she thought, but not without many a heavy sigh from Will, after she had closed the house door and departed. It was often past midnight before she came back, pale and weary, with an almost guilty look on her face, but her face so full of disappointment and hope deferred that Will never had the heart to say what he thought of the folly and hopelessness of the search. Night after night it was renewed, till the days grew to weeks and the weeks to months. All this time, Will did his duty towards her as well as he could, without having any sympathy with her. He stayed at home in the evenings for Tom's sake, and often wished he had Tom's pleasure in reading, for the time hung heavy in his hands as he sat up for his mother. I need not tell you how the mother spent the weary hours, and yet I will tell you something. She used to wander out, at first as if without a purpose, till she rallied her thoughts and brought all of her energies to bear on one point, Then she went with earnest patience among the least known ways to some new part of town, looking wistfully with dumb entreaty into people's faces, sometimes catching a glimpse of a figure which had a kind of momentary likeness to her child's, and following that figure with never wearying perseverance till some light from shop or lamp showed the cold, strange face which was not her daughter's. Once or twice, a kind hearted passer-by, struck by her look of yearning and woe, turned back and offered help, or asked what she wanted. When she spoke when she was spoken to, she answered only, "You don't know a poor girl that they call Lizzie Leigh, do you?" And when they denied all knowledge, she shook her head and went on again. I believe that they thought she was crazy. But she never spoke first to anyone. She sometimes took a few minutes' rest in the doorsteps, and sometimes, very seldom, covered her face and cried. But she could not afford to lose time and chances this way, and while her eyes were blinded with tears, her lost one might pass unseen. One evening, in the rich time of shortening autumn days, Will saw an old man who, without being absolutely drunk, could not guide himself rightly along the footpath, and was mocked for his unsteadiness of gait by the idle boys of the neighborhood. For his father's sake, Will regarded old age with tenderness, even when most degraded and removed from the stern virtues which had dignified his father. So he took the old man home, and seemed to believe his often repeated assurances that he had drank nothing but water. The stranger tried to stiffen himself up to steadiness as he drew nearer home, as if there were someone there for whose respect he cared, even in this half intoxicated state, or whose feelings he feared to grieve. His home was exquisitely clean and neat, even in the outside appearance. Threshold, window, and windowsill were outward signs of some spirit of purity inside. Will was rewarded for his attention by a bright glance of thanks, succeeded by a blush of shame from a young woman of 20 or thereabouts. She did not speak, or second her father's hospitable invitation for him to be seated. She seemed unwilling that a stranger should witness her father's attempts at stately sobriety, and Will could not bear to stay and see her distress. But when the old man, with many a flabby shake of the hand, kept asking him to come again some other evening to see them, Will sought her downcast eyes, and thought that he could not read their veiled meaning, so he answered timidly, "If it is agreeable to anyone, everybody, I'll come, thank ye." But there was no answer from the girl to whom this speech was in reality addressed, and Will left the house, liking her all the better for not speaking. He thought about her a great deal for the next day or two, and he scolded himself for being so foolish as to think of her, and then fell to with a fresh vigor and thought of her more than ever. He tried to depreciate her. He told himself that she was not pretty, and then made an indignant answer that he liked her looks much better than beauty. He wished that he were not so country looking, so red faced and broad shouldered, while she was like a lady with her smooth, colorless complexion, her bright dark hair, and her spotless dress. Pretty or not pretty, she drew his footsteps towards her. He could not resist the impulse that made him wish to see her once more and find out some fault which should unloose his heart from her unconscious keeping. But there she was, as pure and maidenly as before. He sat and looked, answering her father at cross purposes, while she drew more and more into the shadow of the chimney corner and out of sight. Then the spirit that possessed him, it wasn't him, to be sure. It was not him that did this impudent thing. It made him get up and carry a candle to a different place under the pretense of giving her more light for her sewing, but in reality it was to be able to see her better. She could not stand this much longer, but jumped up and said that she must put her little niece to bed, and surely there was never before or since such a troublesome child of 2 years old. For though Will stayed an hour and a half longer, she never came down again. He won her father's heart, though, by his capacity as a listener, for some people are not at all particular, and so they themselves might talk on undisturbed, are not so unreasonable as to expect attention for what they say. Will did gather this much, though, from the old man's talk. He had once been quite a genteel man in a line of business, but had failed for more money than the greengrocer had ever heard of. At least any who did not mix fish and game with greengrocery proper. This grand failure seemed to have been the event of his life, and it was the one that he dwelt on with a strange type of pride. It appeared as if at present he rested from his past exertions in the bankrupt line, and depended upon his daughter, who kept a small school for very young children. But all these particulars Will only remembered and understood once he had left the house. At the time he had heard them, he had been thinking of Susan. After he had made his good footing at Mr. Palmer's, he was not long, you may be sure, without finding more reasons for returning again and again. He listened to her father, he talked to the little niece, but he looked at Susan. Both well he listened and well he talked. Her father kept on insisting upon his former geniality, the details of which would have appeared very questionable in Will's mind if the sweet, delicate, modest Susan had not thrown in an inexplicable air of refinement over everything she came near. But when she moved, it was so noiselessly, and when she did speak, it was in so low and soft a voice that silence, speech, motion, and stillness all alike seemed to remove her high above Will's reach into some saintly and inaccessible air of glory, high above his reach, even as she knew him. And if she were made acquainted with the dark secret behind of his sister's shame, which was kept ever present in his mind by his mother's nightly search among the outcast and forsaken, would she not shrink away from him with loathing, as if he were tainted by even such an involuntary relationship? That was Will's dread, and thereupon followed a resolution that he would withdraw from her sweet company before it was too late. So he resisted the infernal temptation, and he stayed at home and suffered inside. He became angry with his mother for her untiring patience in seeking for one who, he could not help hoping, was dead instead of alive. He spoke sharply to his mother and received only such sad answers as made him reproach himself and still lose more peace of mind. This struggle could not last long without affecting his health, and Tom, his sole companion through the long evenings, noticed his increasing languor, his restless irritability. He noticed it with perplexed anxiety, and at last resolved to call his mother's attention to his brother's haggard, careworn looks. She listened, with a startled recollection of Will's claim upon her love, and she noticed his decreasing appetite and his half-checked sighs. "Will, lad, what's come over thee?" she said to him. "There's naught the matter with me," said he, as if annoyed by her remark. "Nay, lad, but there is." He did not speak again to contradict her. Indeed, she didn't even know if he had heard her, so unmoved did he look. "Would you like to go back to Upclose Farm?" she said. "It's just blackberrying time," said Tom. Will shook his head. She looked at him a while, as if trying to read the expression of despondency and trace it back to its source. Will and Tom could go, said she. I must stay here till I've found her. Thou knowest. She dropped her voice. He turned quickly round, and with all the authority that he at all times exercised over his brother Tom, bade him to go to bed. And when Tom left the room, he prepared to speak. Interesting tale so far. I don't think I like Mr. Leigh, the one who died at the very beginning of the story, and I know I don't like Tom. But as you can definitely tell, this was written in a very different time period. Interesting, though. I am kind of caught up in it. I did read that this story is about a fallen woman. So obviously, old Lizzie Leigh did something. I'm kind of betting that Lizzie is probably this Susan girl, though. That could be a tangled web. Anyway, that is chapter 1 of Lizzie Leigh. We have 2 more chapters, and then we will be on our last story from this book. I don't like Tom. Anyway, tell me what you think. It is definitely an old-fashioned story. All the these and thous might tangle my tongue a little bit. But thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed chapter 1, and I will see you next time.